So, good time of day to everybody and welcome. It's early where I am. It's probably late where you are. This is So You Think You Might Be an Architect. I spoke at another conference about now a year and a half ago, back when those things were still in person, and I introduced myself as a software engineer who is now a software architect. After my talk, one of the attendees approached and asked, I'm an engineer. How do I become an architect? And what does it mean to be one? What do architects do? My reaction to this has been a joke for a long time. And the joke goes like this. Do you know what the difference is between a software engineer, a senior software engineer, and an architect? Well, architects can draw pretty diagrams. And it's a little facetious, it's a little tongue-in-cheek, but some days at work do feel like that. After the joke, I told him that the definition of a software architect is a little nebulous. The path to becoming one can be windy, not very well defined. In fact, I actually spoke at another conference not too long ago, and a few folks in front of me in Q&A were giving their origin story, as it were, and I was very surprised. I think I was the only traditional software engineer to architect pathway. Many of them had very, very unique career paths to arrive at architecture. So in the remaining break time, I listed out some things that software architects do. And I told them, if you're finding yourself doing these things, you might already be an architect, even though no one's giving you the title. So that got me thinking, how do I explain what a software architect is and what she does? Last time I thought about it was when my son was about 6. I was bringing him home from school and he wanted me to carry his backpack. He said he was tired. And I said, well, I'm tired too. I worked all day. And he said, but all you do is press computer buttons. And while it's really, really true, I do press a lot of computer buttons, there is so much more to what I do. And how do I explain that to either a 6-year-old or anybody else? Perhaps a software architect needs a great tagline. A friend of mine who is a head of product team once defined work of a product team as building stuff we can sell and selling stuff we can build, which I thought was spot on. Perhaps an architect needs a great elevator spiel, the 2-minute speech that explains what you do to a stranger who asked in an elevator. But what they really need is an in-depth explanation about what they do for those who want to become one. I wonder what you picture when you think of a software architect. When I think, or at least I used to think about software architects, I used to think about consultants, these people we bring in on a temporary basis to start us off on a big project, implement a new technology, platform, or sometimes to save a project from circling the drain. They come in with a title already, and like I said, they're temporary. They don't stay for too long. What about people who work for companies or government or academia? Aren't there any architects there who don't work for consultancies, don't necessarily travel the world as part of their jobs? Well, now is a good time to introduce myself. I'm a software engineer who is now a software architect of many years. Nowadays, I lead a team of engineers, but I still architect solutions, especially when the project happens to be heavily cross-functional. And I've specialized in healthcare for a long time now. I love the industry. Working there is extremely rewarding. I like knowing that what I do has a direct and positive impact on patients' lives. My company is Guardant Health. We are a leading precision oncology company dedicated to helping conquer cancer. Our blood tests detect cell-free nucleic acids that are shed by tumors into blood at very low concentrations. And our tests are enabling timely therapy selections for patients with cancer. We also have a brand new product that detects cancer recurrence, minimal residual disease. And we're working on early cancer detection, which spans the entire continuum of cancer care. Shameless plug here, we are hiring. If you want to join a great company that's making a difference in patients' lives, reach out. So, how or when did I realize that I was a software architect? I think I first realized that I was an architect maybe during the third presentation of solution options, after first two got thrown out and I had to go back to the drawing board. Or perhaps it was after I got a buy-in for my architecture, but only for a phased implementation, and this beautiful picture proposal got gutted due to timeline constraints. I realized then that there are a lot of compromises in this line of work. And if you know what a good compromise is, it's when no one walks away too happy, and that was definitely one of those types. So, what do architects do? In a nutshell, they provide leadership. That really is the answer. We can stop here, even though we have some time. But of course, there's a lot more here. There's a lot of nuance to the leadership. One of the reasons why I've wanted to do this talk, why I've been doing this talk, is because I don't think it's readily apparent to many people that leadership is a primary function of a software architect. It became very obvious to me when I joined an organization where leadership qualities by themselves held no value. The primary contribution that was valued was code, and because of that, organizational and architectural dysfunctions emerged. So today what I'm going to talk about is what kind of leadership architects provide, what skills they need to provide it, and how to avoid certain common pitfalls. These are the three types of leadership that software architect provides: people, thought, and technical. Software architect operates at the intersection of the three and really utilizes all three to be successful. So if you're leading in those areas, you might already be an architect. In order to be an effective leader in each area, architect needs to develop specific skills that I will go through, starting with our first, and I would argue the most important one, people leadership. What exactly do you do there? Well, first and foremost, you influence. What you're ultimately trying to do is get a buy-in for your solution. And that starts with explaining to the stakeholders what value that solution will bring. And value proposition is very important here. Every stakeholder will come at it with what's in it for me. When I use the word solution, I use it very broadly here. It can be anything from a true technical software solution to a change in business process or technical process, say your deployment process, to organizational or socio-technical change. Influencing involves a lot of conversations at a lot of different levels, from technical to project management to even C-suite. It also involves sifting through a lot of feedback and either incorporating it in your solution or having reasoned arguments why it shouldn't be. After multiple cycles of this separating wheat from the chaff, what you end up with is ultimately a compromise, but one that delivers benefits to every part of organization that it brings. And I'll argue again that this is probably the most important one. If people don't listen or follow you, your solution won't see the light of day. Now, I know at every tech conference, there's a set of famous quotes that gets brought out. I'll hit a couple of them here. I'm hoping that Conway's Law is familiar to most, and effectively what Conway says is that org structure influences architecture. Of course, architect influences architecture very directly. She tries to shape it. However, architect can also influence architecture indirectly by influencing org structure, by aligning teams to platforms, complex subsystems, value streams. There's a lot of good material out there on evolving teams for better software delivery. One of the most interesting books that I've read recently is Team Topologies by Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pace. But the point here is you as an architect can bring that knowledge in and help shape the organization and thereby shape the architecture. The next area is growing new leadership, next generation of architects. It's difficult to accomplish large objectives alone. To be honest, it's not that much fun either. The best way to get another peer architect is to train one. Find someone who aspires to reach the next level and provide the necessary guidance and opportunity to develop all of these skills we'll talk about today. Knowledge sharing is another important area of people leadership. Architect is often a hub of information. They're exposed to the full range, from technical to business to product to project management. They can meaningfully convey information to various functions. They also interpret information and understand the potential impacts. In fact, in my current position, I do a lot of that interpretation, this translation of what are the software implications of a particular business initiative. And these translations do get quite complex. Since architects have this information, it becomes incumbent upon them to get the right information at the right time and at the right level to their team in order for them to be successful in their initiatives. So what skills do you need to be an effective people leader? Well, funny as that sounds, people skills. First, to influence, you need to understand motivation and find a personal approach. Some people are going to be motivated by learning, some by recognition, some by building something cool and new. Teams are going to be motivated by different factors. Executive team may be motivated by revenue or reputation, marketing by getting a product out for industry event, regulatory team by compliance, sales team by being able to gain a bigger sales territory. Coaching and teaching skills are critical for growing talent and creating next generation of architects. Providing guidance and feedback and not just doing everything yourself is a very important skill, tempting as it may be sometimes. You need to delegate and support others as they work through problems without giving all the answers. What you really need is create room for experimentation and mistakes. Have tolerance for those mistakes while setting guardrails to avoid catastrophic failures. We can't afford projects to just disappear and crash. Communication skills are very important. If you watch carefully, all skills here they involve some level of communication. And even though they call it a soft skill, I would argue that it's quite hard, as in difficult, to be a great communicator. What does it mean to be a great communicator? It means engaging in a healthy and constructive debate, putting together well-reasoned arguments, avoiding groupthink, listening and absorbing rather than just reacting. It means tailoring your message to your audience and having the right amount of detail. I can talk about the same initiative to the technical team or to C-suite, and it's going to sound very, very different in language. That skill is absolutely critical to being understood. I actually had a vivid example of how critical this skill is when a colleague of mine who was a lead developer temporarily got elevated to a leadership position. Suddenly his audience is comprised of executives from various functions, but he never adjusted his language and he was addressing them as if he was addressing a group of developers. And the tension, the frustration on both sides were palpable. Neither side felt like they were getting the right information, and neither side felt understood. And of course, this expands beyond just verbal skills. A good architect wants to write things down and understands the value of written word. I was very happy to see a presentation earlier today all about documentation. That was really, really awesome. I don't necessarily agree with all of the methodologies, but I very much agree that we need to have documentation. Of course, they can be counter to Agile Manifesto, or in general, Agile tenets that code is the only documentation you need. Anyone who said that has never been in an audit. You do not want to put your code in front of the auditor because that just makes them ask more questions. And you want auditors not to ask questions. Writing things down helps organize and structure your thoughts. It allows everyone to level set and disseminate information effectively. I am sure that everyone here has been in that one meeting when we're trying to understand a new problem. We talked about it for an hour and we walked out with a good understanding of the problem, only to realize next time we got together is that everybody walked away with a slightly different understanding of the problem. Writing things down can really help reduce those types of occurrences and level set everyone. Now I want to digress for a minute and talk about this concept of near enemy. I heard this concept used at a different conference talk, and I really liked it, so I figured I'd borrow it for my own. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Near enemy and far enemy are concepts that come from Buddhism. There's these 4 virtues, 4 immeasurables, and their enemies. While far enemy is really obvious, it's the complete opposite of the virtue. Near enemy it may look like a virtue, but it differs from it in subtle but dangerous way. Similarly, each leadership that we talk about today has a near enemy. Something that might look like that leadership, but differs from it in a subtle and unhelpful way. So what's the near enemy of people leadership? It is functional management. Now I want to be very clear. There is nothing wrong with functional management. In fact, it's a very necessary skill. Functional manager hires, fires, reviews, promotes, builds a team, works on career and skills. In short, she's a people manager. She's also a manager of a specific function, let's say manufacturing, and she's responsible for execution of all projects that involve that function. That's another range of responsibilities from managing resources, budgets, timelines, and technical aspects of the project. This is where it gets tricky. Pure functional management without influence component doesn't really get you that far. Bringing it back to software, there are 2 types of architects, those with teams and those without, meaning those who manage functional teams and those who don't. I've seen both kinds. I've also been both kinds. And I would argue that being one without a team is more challenging because you really need to leverage your influence in order to get anything accomplished. When you have a team, however, it's easy to fall into the trappings of thinking that you can get what you need done without relying on your influence heavily. So what does functional management look like without influence? Well, it looks like telling people what to do, task mastering. You might accomplish your objectives, but support for your decisions will be grudging without proper buy-in. And the effect of that is the decisions that you've made get reopened frequently, slowing down progress. And of course, your position power extends only to your team, doesn't really work on stakeholders, doesn't work on peer teams that you might need in order to accomplish those larger cross-functional objectives. If I contrast this with people management or with leadership with influence, much of it becomes getting the buy-in, which starts with the value of your idea, the value proposition, convincing people what you're trying to do is a good idea. And second, and very important, making people feel like they're part of the solution. And that can range from anything from giving credit, explaining, to making people think that they came up with a solution, doing that little inception trick. So moving on to our second leadership, technical leadership. How does architect lead in the technology realm? Well, first, by constant learning. You have to know technology in order to make educated choices, understand trade-offs. We all know how fast technology moves. There's always something new. We get patterns, we get practices, we get trends, we get frameworks. I've heard some very interesting stuff here today about patterns and frameworks. Well, how many JavaScript frameworks are out there? This constant learning, of course, comes paired with teaching and information sharing we talked about. In order for that knowledge to get applied, it can't be hoarded. Architect evangelizes to the team, shows value of the new things, and drives progress. Second, technical leadership takes shape of scaffolding projects. While you may not be able to implement a project start to finish, creating a scaffold for implementation ensures that design materializes as you envision it and cements patterns. What the scaffold is really depends on the project. It can be anything: technology selection, data model, workflow, process definition, integration paradigm, API definition, service boundary, any combination of those. Since architecture is about important stuff, whatever that is, that's another famous quote, identify what is important or foundational to your project and scaffold it. Conversely, you can identify what is likely to go wrong and cause a big collapse and work on scaffolding it. Third, leadership is selecting a toolbox. I'll go back to my question of how many JavaScript frameworks are out there? Angular, React, Node, 5, 10 maybe? How many do you need? 1, hopefully, right? How do you know which one? Which one is better for a given project, long-term? How do you balance that with skill set that you already have available on the team? Architects analyze tools, collaborate on tool selection, rollout, and training. Another important thing that they do from the other side of the tool spectrum is they help prevent tool proliferation and duplication. 1 JavaScript framework. This always happens to me with logging and monitoring tools, and happened recently. I don't know why those tools, there's never just one. There's always at least 2, and recently I was dealing with as many as 4. Relic, Splunk, Grafana, and so on. Did we need all 4 of them? Probably not. But people brought in what they knew, and without architect leading that conversation, this proliferation occurs. This is where architect can help. So what skills do you need to be a tech lead? Well, again, as funny as it sounds, you need technical skills, but again, let's break them down to specific skills needed for each area. For constant learning, if you know this book, All I Really Need to Know, I Learned in Kindergarten. These skills get taught from kindergarten and up. There are 4 C's: critical thinking, creative thinking, communication, and collaboration. Notice that communication comes up here again. For building a scaffold, you need your broad software engineering skills. There is a lot there, but I will summarize it as foundational engineering coding skills, plus tools and frameworks, plus best practice thinking. So your patterns. To fill out your toolbox with right tools, your best friends are your analytical skills. You're surveying the market, and that is not the same thing as going after next shiny thing. Aside from technical need and fit, there's many more aspects to evaluate, such as maturity of the tool and your willingness or ability to become an early adopter. Sometimes in a highly regulated industry, you can't afford to bring on a tool that hasn't been vetted by time. Other aspects might be level of support you might get for the tool, licensing considerations, current skill set makeup of your team, and your ability to hire or train, and whether those new skills are going to uplift the team or maybe do the opposite. Of course, technical leadership has its own near enemy, and that near enemy is being a really in the weeds technical contributor with hands on keyboard all the time. Now, just like there's nothing wrong with functional management, there's nothing wrong with being an individual contributor. That is just an architect who doesn't also have a team. And of course, we all want to keep our coding skills sharp. I will come back to that momentarily. However, being really deep in the weeds and having tactical coding responsibilities, stories you need to deliver, bugs you need to fix, rarely leaves time for broader strategy. Remember the organization that I mentioned where leadership skills were not valued? I initially went along and started delivering tactically, and I felt just like that guy in the comic. And as long as I was deep in the code, I had no time to deal with anything strategic, even basic things like tool selection for the team. And the moment I started working on strategic initiatives, I became a bottleneck for code delivery. But the question that I asked myself is, can I be an architect without coding every day? It is a tough question. My answer to that after thinking for some time is yes, but with some conscious effort. In my experience, few things have helped. First, doing proofs of concepts, greenfield projects, new tech evaluation projects. All of these are variations on a theme being something new is being brought in, and you get a chance to do the learning. You can go as low as deep or as shallow as you want. And the risk is low because your code is not likely to go straight to production, not without some rework. So if you get an opportunity to work on those, take it. Second is keep a pet project, that is. I am sure many of us have that one project that some time ago we either wrote or we heavily contributed to that somehow we're still shepherding to this day, whether it makes sense or not. Well, you're already familiar with the code base. Going in once in a while and implementing new feature or pattern can keep your skills sharp. Now, this last category is not a desirable occurrence, but it does happen when an architect needs to roll up her sleeves and start coding in order to rescue a project. Though when it does happen, it gives you an opportunity to level up in a high pressure situation. So even if you don't code every day, if you maintain the sine wave of going deep and coming back to high level strategies, you can maintain your skills. Finally, our last bubble here is thought leadership. This is your strategic leadership, which starts with big picture thinking. Architects live at big picture level, harmonizing requirements, technologies, solutions. Start by understanding what the big picture is right now. Learn some of its past history. Learn how all the bumps and bruises were acquired so you don't repeat that history. But keep in mind that it's a balancing act. While you want to have those learnings, you don't want to be bogged down by them and fear change. Once you know what the big picture looks like, roadmap its evolution. You want to have a roadmap beyond your next release, but you also don't want to roadmap too far in the future. 3-year plans to me they change so much a year in that they're almost not worth making sometimes. The most useful planning period that I found has been 6 months to a year. And that roadmap becomes a living entity that an architect maintains. Next, champion process. Process tends to be a dirty word in software development. We all remember move fast and break things. However, having come from a regulated industry where mistakes can be very costly and affect people's lives, I've come to appreciate the role of software development process in champion in the organization. Process gets associated with something very heavy-handed, waterfall-like, bureaucratic, full of documentation no one maintains. It does not have to be the case. Process is there to catch you when you fall. That's not an if, because mistakes will get made, but when. Process is also there to instill much needed engineering discipline, doing code reviews, getting peer feedback, following best practices. The key point to remember is that process serves developers, not the other way around. It is up to software architect to continuously evaluate and improve process so that it works for your specific organization or industry. Process in a small growing org is not going to look the same as process in a large mature org, regulated industry versus unregulated, and so on. In short, architect champions process and makes it another tool in their toolbox. Last, set culture and values. Management consultant Peter Drucker once said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Does that mean that all the strategy stuff I just talked about is not important? Not at all. But what it does speak to is the power of culture and how critical it is to success of organization and projects. Software architects should have values, and they're in a unique position to build, change, or influence culture in their organization. Here's where being an architect with a team, and it makes it a little bit easier to set culture, at least within your own team. And especially at the team formation stages, hiring, onboarding, and so on. However, culture within a single team is often not enough. No single team is an island, and architects should work to influence culture across teams. Now, what are the values a software architect might have? I will give you just one of mine. That's all we're going to have time for. But I do hope that you think about what you consider your North Star and explain it to yourself and to others. So simplicity is my biggest value, and I don't think simplicity is sufficiently appreciated. As you can see from this quote, this is not a new value in the land of software. We work in complex and ever-changing field. We are expected to be experts in the technology. We're also expected to be pretty well-versed in the vertical aspects of the business. I heard that said a little bit earlier, domain-driven design, understanding the business, understanding the use cases. We solve complex problems, which means complexity naturally arises in our solutions. Those things that we have to solve is our essential complexity. And of course, then there's other kind of complexity, the kind that happens when we want to future-proof something. We add bells and whistles, we obsess with clean code, we obsess with design patterns, we have 4 ways of deploying things. That is our accidental complexity. So why is simplicity a value I espouse to? First, simple solutions decrease cognitive load. Cognitive load is basically the amount of mental effort that I have to expend to solve a problem. Mental capacity is limited, at least mine is, and you want to focus all of that capacity on your essential complexity. If everything is complex, you eventually run out of capacity because you solve non-essential problems and you start making mistakes. Every industry has its own essential complexity. It's not just rocket science. I guarantee it. If you talk to anyone out of any industry, even the one you don't think has complexity, that person will promptly tell you something very esoteric that they have to deal with all the time. That is the essential complexity of their work. Second, simple solutions are maintainable. If you think about where you spend most time, it's not solution design or implementation, it is maintenance. And unnecessarily complex solutions will make that job difficult, causing a range of issues up to and including attrition from your team. So I'll say this about simplicity. Simple doesn't mean basic. Simple doesn't mean feature poor. Simple means elegant, and it actually takes a lot of work to come up with a simple solution for a complex problem, but the results are very much worth it. So, back to skills. What skills do you need for thought leadership? They're not technically skills in the strictest sense of the word, they're more character traits, but the ones that still need development. And the unifying theme here is drive for constant improvement and being a change agent. You're not satisfied with status quo, you strive to make things better. You are capable of using any experience, success or failure, for learning. You have that desire to go back and understand why something succeeded or failed, draw some conclusions and course correct if needed. You have flexibility, tolerance for failure, curiosity, willingness to experiment, and you have emotional intelligence. You're a change agent, and change is hard for everyone. You want to be sensitive to that, and you want and understand how your team absorbs and deals with change. While these traits might sound counter to those structured and process-oriented, they really aren't. They become a foundation and starting point for improvements, putting order to chaos and creating a functional process. Of course, we should talk about the near enemy of thought leadership, and in this case, it's ivory tower architect. Ivory tower architect makes architecture an academic exercise without real and practical value attached to it. Remember that at the end of the day, you have to ship working code that has business value. If you don't have that, your architecture has no value. Ivory tower architects always get enamored with the right way of doing things rather than balancing out right and pragmatic or realistic. Architecture is never a clean and pretty picture that you draw in PowerPoint. There are always trade-offs and compromises that need to be made. One sign that you may have an ivory tower architect is they make architecture process exclusionary, creating committees and approval boards. Architecture process is a lot more democratic. If you ask me who architects software, I'd say everyone, from product to quality. But architect happens to be the person who drives the process, responsible for producing the artifacts, and accountable for the results. The other sign of ivory tower is process for the sake of process. Places where you see process as bureaucratic, used to check boxes rather than bring practical value, or sometimes reactive and punitive, where mistakes are dealt with by adding more process, is also typical of that academic mindset. To avoid that, always ask yourself, what value does a particular decision or process change bring to the table? If the answer is unclear or none, avoid it. So let's talk about what do architects do in practical terms, other than press the proverbial computer buttons. I'll outline a 4-phase process and artifacts for each phase. This will look very neat in PowerPoint, everything always does, but process is not that linear. There's loops, returns, and phases are different size and scale. First thing that architect will do is get to the core of a problem, performing analysis that supports their problem definition. This typically is a big task that requires eliciting information from multiple stakeholders. There's your communication skills at work. Creating a succinct and meaningful problem statement is critical to building a solution. Otherwise, how do you know what you're solving? This where you want to go, your destination, is very important. I'll give you an example. We're losing $25 million annually due to incorrect billing practices is a wonderful problem statement because you know exactly where you want to go from here. You want to stop losing $25 million annually or get that number down to something that business is willing to live with. The artifact, so in this problem statement, what you have is undesirable outcomes that are happening or sometimes desirable outcomes that aren't. The artifacts produced in addition to problem statement is some supporting analysis. If you are giving specific numbers, which you almost always should, you should back them up with some data. And some as-is documentation that might elucidate where the problems are originating. If you have a destination, you should have a starting point as well. This is the phase where you create your solution proposal, or I should say proposals, since it goes through the vetting process. And during that process, it will likely change sometimes quite significantly. This is the time for diagrams. We knew there was going to be time for diagrams and other to-be documentation. There's several other very important things that happen in this phase. If there's any technology selection to be made, it happens here, along with any proofs of concepts that vet either the technology or the entire solution. The other important output here is names for concepts or ubiquitous language. Most of your ubiquitous language will be revealed in the first phase when you're defining a problem. However, anything new that's being introduced needs to be named, and this is the phase where it happens, where these new terms enter your ubiquitous language. This is the phase where you take your solution from concept or proof of concept to production. Consulting architects don't often stay for this phase. And as you can see from artifacts, this is where you're building a scaffold for the project, and if possible or necessary, your production grade code. But the most important thing that happens here that the architect does is they're managing change. As implementation starts, you will discover assumptions that have not been voiced, requirements creep, technology limitations previously undiscovered, and you will need to change and adapt to compensate for these new discoveries. This last phase, which is always the longest, is enhancement and maintenance. The chevrons are not drawn to scale, otherwise this one will take most of the slide. Code is running in production and you get to live with consequences of your decisions, which is what distinguishes an in-house architect versus a consultant. The measure of success is not whether you have to make a change. The answer to that question is always yes. The measure of success is how big of a change you need to make and how easily you can make it. So at the start of the talk, I mentioned having a tagline for software architects. I know the analogy with civil architects and building a house has been used many times. It's a good one for a reason. There are many moving parts behind a facade. This is your last diagram of the day, plumbing diagram. Visualizing those things and putting them together in a cohesive design and a working solution, that doesn't make you take a cold shower when somebody runs a dishwasher, is what an architect does. So my take on the tagline is making invisible visible. If anyone has a better one, I'd love to hear from you. Send it to me. I might use it in my next talk, with credit to author, of course. So, in summary, software architects provide leadership in 3 major areas: people, technical, and thought. And if you're leading in the 3 areas, you might already be an architect. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonya. So, but first off, what do you say then? Does our Archangel pass the test?
Oh, I was ticking boxes here.
Sorry, Sonya?
How did he do on the box check?
For me, he passes with flying colors.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think so too. But indeed, Sonia, thanks a lot for the talk. I want to say exactly the same thing, but I was unmuted, the classic thing for last year and this year. But there were a lot of things that struck a chord. And for instance, one that I think I like the most is that split between essential complexity and accidental complexity. And this brings me back to something that we all developers love to do, and that's estimating things. And whenever we do that, we always, or almost always, unfortunately, estimate what's called essential complexity, whereas accidental complexity is actually higher. I had a lot of moments where I would look at something, discuss requirements, and then say, all right, it's going to take me 3 days. And then you look under the hood and say, okay, 2 weeks.
Yeah, estimation is hard. I can't say that I've mastered the skill, but I have some methods by which I can, for lack of a better word, pad the estimates, understanding that there will be accidental complexity, and there might even be undiscovered essential complexity that we haven't worked through. So it's that cone of uncertainty that we need to work through. And only when we look under the hood do we know, okay, this is going to take a lot longer than I thought.
Right, exactly. And also makes me think about architecture. I don't know, the perfect design of a system. Doesn't that follow the same path? I mean, you can take the best decisions once you went through the whole way, and then you can see, look, I would have done this differently had I known this requirement will pop up.
Yeah, I don't think there is a perfect architecture. I think that's a fallacy. You make the best decisions you can with the information you have. You can't make the decisions for the future. And sometimes we do, sometimes we try to future-proof. And to me, it's a coin toss. It works exactly half the time. I've seen code that people have written for the future that was never used. And I've seen some very prescient things that people have done. And I'm like, oh, how did they know that might happen? So to me, it's a game of chance.
I think we had this in a talk yesterday. Kevlin Henney was saying that one of the best things we could do is just either delay our decisions or let's say minimize the impact that such a new change would make in our design.
Oh, I'm a huge fan of this concept that I tell everybody called last responsible moment. Figure out what the last responsible moment is to make a decision and make it then. Don't make it before. Because if you make a decision too early, high probability you're going to need to reverse it. But if you go past last responsible moment, time makes the decision for you. The indecision is the worst of it. And when you get past a certain time, you no longer have, say, an opportunity to bring in something new, to explore something. So time just kind of makes a decision for you to stay with whatever you have already.
Totally agree. Although sometimes in practice, it's pretty difficult to see when that exact moment is.
It is, I agree. I tend to delay large, let's just say, external purchases as much as possible. And anything small, I equate it to remodeling a house. This is always comes back to when I had to remodel a house. Anything that I can replace easily, I can make that solution, or I can make that decision early. So if I'm picking a color for the walls, what's the worst that can happen? I'll repaint if I hate the color. If I'm picking a tile for the bathroom, once that tile is in, ripping it out is going to cost me a lot of money. So I better make that decision and stick with it. That's kind of how I break this down, but it's not a hard science by any stretch.
Yeah, but indeed, it's I think it's a good take on it. And speaking of decisions, we have a question from the audience. Is how do you moderate programming language selection?
I don't know if I moderate it necessarily. I think programming language selection might be one of those things that happens at such an early stage that first people on the floor end up making that decision without, without being very conscious about it. And it's typically, do I know this? I mean, there's things that are fit for purpose. There's, R is used for a lot of scientific work. So chances are, if you're a scientist, you're going to end up using R. That's just what it's designed for. But for enterprise development, if people walk in the door with a Microsoft experience, it's going to be C#. If they walk in and they have Java experience, it's going to be Java. And honestly, all of them, most of them serve, I should say. Where you start struggling is more on the hiring front. If you have something very, very esoteric and you can't hire or train, or people don't want to do this, that's where you're going to have problems, and you're going to need to look for a replacement effectively. But I'm a big fan of letting developers drive this as long as it's fit for purpose. Languages are, I heard the last speaker talk, you can work in a lot of different languages. Some are easier, some are harder, but ultimately it's not a differentiator.
Yeah, definitely. I also think that most of the decision is taken by what the team or the people doing the project are proficient at.
Yeah. And it's almost okay to have multiple different languages, even within the same enterprise. If you have a team that's proficient in C#, let them build things in C#, as long as they expose APIs, and then language doesn't matter. The intercommunication takes place in a language agnostic way.
Yeah, and it's also the, let's say, what we call modern programming paradigms help in this respect. So here's another question. How do you make sure that you have the same good practices across all projects you're responsible for? Or, let's say, if an organization has multiple projects, how do you replicate practices?
That gets tough. And I think it depends on what the projects are. Sometimes not all the same practices apply, but certain ones, let's talk about something agnostic of the type of project. Let's talk about code reviews and say PR reviews. You can enforce that in the system to say, I need at least 2 people to look at your pull request before it gets committed. That is, that we can enforce with the system, and honestly, it becomes simpler. What I do like better than enforcement is I like to have, within every team, I like to have champions of those best practices and have them champion it within their own team. I don't want to come in there and lay down the law. I want for the team to see the benefit of, oh, look, we've been doing these peer reviews, and now we don't get our customers complaining about bugs. So I want them to see the benefit of their own best practices and have champions within the team.
You can say it's more of a cultural thing, right, within the teams or the organization. Because if we enforce things, they can also be gamed,
Yeah.
right? And then you have two people accept it, and that's that. That doesn't mean it's a thorough review or somebody.
It's true, but that almost builds some muscle memory. And we actually, if we talk about that, we have Slack channels that are dedicated to code reviews where people say, hey, I have this pull request. I need a couple people to come look at it, you know, and so it goes. So that's been working out very nicely, actually, because people have visibility to what broader teams are doing. People can comment on things. Sometimes it's simple syntax, sometimes it's broader functionality that people have comments on. So it's been a really good collaborative environment that way.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, there's a related question, but a bit on the same line. So then how do you make people accept good practices? I think you need to make them buy into them, right? And get sponsors for, yeah, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the curve of change, it looks like this. There's a few early adopters. There's this whole big set of people in the middle that are wait and see people. I'm going to see how this works out, and then I'll accept it. And then there is a small tail end here of people who really, really resist change. I want to engage the early adopters. I want to bring in the people in the middle and say, hey, look at this. This can be better for you. At least give it a chance. Try this out. See how it works. If you really hate it, let's talk about it. And then eventually we drag the resistors along for the ride. So as long as you get that bulk going, the rest will work. So it becomes part of the culture, and then people who resist end up being outliers, and they either adapt or they leave.
Yeah, indeed. And but bottom line is you need to get people to see the value in that certain practice. And yeah, for some it's immediate, for others will.
Yeah, and conversely, if it has no value, it's not a best practice. Maybe not here.
Yeah, maybe something works for a team or a project and doesn't work for another. I think that's the beauty of I know, adaptive frameworks, right? Like Scrum or Kanban. That you can build your own set of practices in the team, but there's also the caveat that it's a bare minimum framework and you need to bring things in, but if you don't, you're gonna lose a lot as well.
There's actually another value that I didn't talk about today because this talk is a little shorter, but that value is no dogma. There's a lot of frameworks, a lot of methodologies out there. I found each one has something useful to offer. They didn't all evolve because they're trying to instill something completely abstract, but not all of it is useful in every situation. And I feel very comfortable pulling things that I find useful for my current situation and using those rather than saying, well, we're just going to do Agile proper. We can't. We're not Spotify. That's always the example. We're a regulated industry. We're never going to be Spotify. But that doesn't mean that I can pull out useful learnings from Agile and apply it to the team as needed.
Yeah, exactly, because you mentioned regulated environment, and it made me think of Alistair Colburn's scale, where the level of formalism in your project is also driven by how regulated your environment is, and then the number of people that are working on the project. Because you can have some practices for even a regulated project where with 5 people, but if there's 1,000 people, you need more formalism.
Yeah, you live in a different world. If you Google design controls, which is something that healthcare and medical device industry has to comply by, you will see very prescriptive steps that you have to take. You have to have your design before you implement things, because if you have to have the objectives designed, because let's say you're designing a toothbrush, which in case you didn't know is a medical device, and you have evolutionary design and it evolves being a tongue depressor, which is also a medical device. It's not the same thing. You can't very well say that you've accomplished what you set out to accomplish. It no longer cleans your teeth. It doesn't accomplish the objective. So there's some very prescriptive steps there, and you follow different methodologies, but it doesn't mean that we couldn't blend some agile development practices into it and stay within the framework of design controls.
Right, definitely. Let me check again the questions. Okay, we can take one more. It's still oriented to dealing with people and the culture. How do you deal with people that are not at your level and tend to take things personally? I think the latter is more important.
I think the level thing is very interesting because what I discovered time and time again, and to me, this has always been a very interesting quirk, is we as software engineers are expected to understand how business works, right? We facilitate that business. There is no expectation the other way. Business is not expected to understand how we develop software. They don't care that we have to do A, then B, then C, then come back to A. They just want working software. So doing some of this education in a way that becomes, that isn't patronizing, that is clear for people who are not at your level, that don't have your depth of knowledge, is a skill that really needs developing. Taking things personally, it's tough. I take things personally. I try to not react immediately and try and understand deeper where they're coming from first, because there's probably some motivation there that I'm not understanding. But really trying to share the knowledge in a way that your audience understands, I think that's the critical skill. Assume that no one knows what you do and see how you can make it simple for others to understand it.
Yeah, and it's a two-way street. I'm referring to what you said at first. We as developers need to learn the domain, but then also I think the business stakeholders need to get some insight or transparency into what we're building and the architecture and the decisions we've been making. Because it's always, most of the time, it's a given that maybe some new requirement comes along and it will put your whole design off balance. But that's not necessarily the biggest problem. The biggest problem is all the business stakeholders will be shocked and say, yeah, we didn't think it's such a big problem. But then if you try to make your decisions more transparent towards them as well, maybe they will think about, hey, this might come along, and they will tell you, I don't know, half a year sooner.
Yeah, I find it difficult to explain complexity of our work. And I think it's worth thinking about how you explain it to the stakeholders, because I don't want to go into how, building the CI/CD pipeline is going to take some extra days. I want to give them an example why, say, this need that they have makes, working with our existing software makes things more complicated and is going to take more days. And a lot of the time, if you don't have that good explanation, what you get is, why does this take so long? Why is this so complicated? This isn't hard. All I'm asking for is this. So it is a skill to develop, is explaining the complexity in a way that lands with your stakeholders.
I always have a saying about this. It's like everybody, well, a lot of people own cars. That doesn't mean a car is a cheap thing, right?
Yeah.
It's expensive to buy.
Yeah, and most people don't know how cars work.
Yeah.
It shouldn't need to. That's why there's people who build them and maintain them. And that's where everything under the hood, I don't want to care. I just want to press the paddle and it goes.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Sonya.
My pleasure. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for the opportunity.
It will be our pleasure to continue this conversation on a different edition. So we'll definitely reach out. And yeah, you were the closing session of the day. So
Perfect.
again, thanks a lot